In the year 1953, in a quiet and peaceful corner of Florida, there existed a small town called Boomersville. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, a place where doors were rarely locked, neighbors greeted each other every morning, and life moved at a slow, comfortable pace. Nothing unusual ever seemed to happen there. At least, that's what people believed. Boomersville was a simple town. Small houses with white fences, children riding bicycles on dusty streets, men going to work every morning, and housewives taking care of their families. It was the picture of the perfect American dream. And in the middle of that peaceful little world lived a woman named Anita Deck. To the outside world, Anita Deck was the definition of perfection. She was beautiful, elegant, soft-spoken, kind-hearted, or at least that's how she appeared. Anita lived in a modest but lovely house on Maple Street. Her garden was always clean, her windows always shining, and her front porch always decorated with fresh flowers. Every morning she could be seen waving at neighbors with a warm and friendly smile. People in Boomersville admired her. Women wanted to be like her. Men respected her. Children adored her. She was known as the ideal housewife. Whenever there was a community event, Anita was always there helping, smiling, talking politely to everyone. She baked pies for neighbors, attended church regularly, and never missed a chance to lend a helping hand. If someone asked about Anita Deck, the answer was always the same. Oh, she's such a lovely woman. No one could ever imagine that behind that gentle face and warm personality, something very dark was hidden. Something no one in Boomersville could even begin to suspect. You see, Anita had a story that no one ever talked about, a story that no one ever questioned. Because in small towns like Boomersville, people didn't dig too deep into each other's pasts. They accepted what they saw on the surface and never bothered to look beneath. And on the surface, Anita Deck looked flawless. But perfection can sometimes be the most convincing disguise. By 1953, Anita was living with her new husband. To the neighbors, they seemed like a normal, happy couple. They went shopping together, attended social gatherings, and appeared deeply in love. Nothing about them seemed unusual. Yet, there was something strange about Anita's life, something that most people never noticed. No one ever saw any old photographs of her family. No one ever heard her talk about her childhood. No one ever met any relatives. It was as if Anita Deck had simply appeared out of nowhere one day, already perfect, already polished, already prepared to play the role of the ideal wife. And that, in itself, was unusual. But Boomersville was not a town of suspicion. People didn't ask too many questions. They didn't investigate. They didn't doubt. They simply accepted Anita for who she appeared to be, a charming, lovely, respectable woman. Still, there were small things, tiny details, that a few observant people quietly noticed. For example, Anita never spoke much about her past. Whenever someone asked where she came from, she would gently change the subject. If someone asked about her previous life, she would smile and say, "Oh, it's not very interesting," and people would leave it at that, because why wouldn't they? She was polite, she was graceful, she was trustworthy. At least, she seemed to be. Every morning, Anita followed the same routine. She woke up early, prepared breakfast, cleaned her house, and went about her day like any other ordinary woman in town. From the outside, her life looked calm and peaceful. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors claimed they saw lights on in her house when everyone else was asleep. Some said they heard strange noises. Others mentioned seeing Anita digging in her garden at odd hours. Of course, these were just rumors, nothing more than small-town gossip, and gossip never meant much in Boomersville. Still, there was one thing about Anita that even the most trusting neighbors found a little strange. She had been married before, actually more than once, but no one really knew the details. Whenever the topic came up, Anita would give vague answers. "Yes, I was married when I was younger," she would say softly. "Things just didn't work out." It sounded normal enough. After all, many people had failed marriages. There was nothing suspicious about that. But what people didn't know, what they had never bothered to find out, was that Anita Deck had not been married just once before, or twice, or even 3 times. By 1953, Anita had already had 6 previous husbands, and every single one of them had mysteriously disappeared, without a trace, without an explanation, without a goodbye. But Boomersville didn't know that. Not yet. To them, Anita was simply a pleasant woman starting a new chapter in her life. A woman who deserved happiness. A woman who had finally found love again. No one realized that behind her sweet smile, there were secrets buried deeper than anyone could imagine. Secrets that would one day shock the entire town. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people are not the ones who look frightening. Sometimes, they are the ones who smile the brightest, the ones who seem the kindest, the ones no one would ever suspect. And in Boomersville, in 1953, no one suspected Anita Deck. Not even for a second. Music becomes slightly darker, but every story has two sides, and this one was only just beginning. For years, the people of Boomersville believed they knew everything about Anita Deck. They believed she was just another ordinary woman trying to live a peaceful life, a kind neighbor, a loving wife, a respectable member of the community. But the truth was far stranger than anyone could have imagined. Behind the perfect image Anita presented to the world, there was a history, a hidden past that almost no one in Boomersville had ever taken the time to investigate. And that past was far from ordinary. You see, Anita Deck was not the simple housewife she pretended to be. Long before she arrived in Boomersville, long before she became the admired woman of Maple Street, Anita had lived many different lives in many different towns. And in each of those lives, there had been one disturbing pattern: marriage and disappearance. By 1953, Anita had already been married 6 times. 6 different men, 6 different weddings, 6 different beginnings. And yet, not a single one of those marriages had a normal ending. To the people of Boomersville, this was completely unknown. They only knew Anita as she appeared in the present calm, gentle, and devoted to her new husband. No one ever imagined that before him there had been others, many others. But somewhere, hidden in old courthouse records and forgotten documents, the truth quietly existed. Anita Deck had a long and mysterious marital history. Her first marriage had taken place when she was very young, barely out of her teenage years. According to old records, she married a traveling salesman named Thomas Reed. They were said to be a happy couple, at least in the beginning. Neighbors from that time later recalled that Anita and Thomas seemed perfectly normal. They went to church together, attended social gatherings, and appeared deeply in love. But less than 2 years after their wedding, Thomas Reed vanished. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. Anita told people he had left her, that he had grown tired of married life and decided to move to another state. No one questioned her story. After all, men sometimes left their wives. It wasn't unheard of. So life went on. A few years later, Anita married again. Her second husband was a factory worker named George Milton. This marriage followed the exact same pattern as the first. At first, everything seemed wonderful. They looked happy together. Friends described them as a loving couple with a bright future. And then, suddenly, George Milton disappeared as well. Once again, Anita gave the same explanation. "He left me," she said calmly. "He didn't want this life anymore." And once again, people believed her. After all, why wouldn't they? There was no evidence of anything suspicious. No signs of struggle. No reason to doubt her. Then came husband number 3, and husband number 4, and husband number 5. Each marriage began with hope, smiles, and celebration. And each one ended in exactly the same strange, unexplainable way, with the husband disappearing without a trace. By the time Anita married for the 6th time, a few people in her previous towns had started whispering. 6 husbands, 6 disappearances. It was an unbelievable coincidence. But coincidences do happen, don't they? Or at least, that's what people told themselves. Anita always had a story ready. Sometimes she said her husband had run away with another woman. Sometimes she claimed he had gone looking for work and never returned. Other times, she simply shrugged and said, "Men change. People leave." Her explanations were always simple, always believable, always calm. And because she never acted nervous, never appeared guilty, and never showed any signs of fear, no one ever pushed further. But deep down, a few people began to wonder. How could the same thing happen 6 times to the same woman? How could every man she married just disappear from the face of the earth? Still, there was never any proof of wrongdoing. No bodies were found. No crimes were reported. No investigations were opened. And without evidence, suspicion remained only suspicion. So Anita kept moving forward, from town to town, from husband to husband, from life to life, until finally she arrived in Boomersville, Florida. To the people there, she was simply a new face in town, a friendly woman starting over. No one knew about the 6 men who had come before. No one knew about the strange pattern that followed her wherever she went. And Anita certainly had no intention of telling them. In Boomersville, She reinvented herself completely. She became the perfect neighbor, the perfect wife, the perfect citizen. And for a while, it seemed like her past had finally been left behind. But the past has a way of never truly disappearing. Even when people try their hardest to bury it, there were small clues, tiny cracks in her perfect story. For example, whenever someone asked Anita about her family, she always avoided giving details. When neighbors innocently asked, "Have you been married before?" she would simply smile and reply, "Oh yes, a long time ago, but that was another life." And then she would quickly change the subject. No photographs, no letters, no memories, just silence. Looking back now, it seems almost unbelievable that no one noticed. But in a quiet town like Boomersville, people trusted each other. They didn't assume the worst. They didn't imagine that evil could live right next door. So Anita Deck lived peacefully among them, carrying her secrets like invisible shadows. 6 husbands, 6 disappearances, and not a single answer. The truth was out there somewhere, hidden in old towns, forgotten records, and unmarked memories. But in Boomersville, none of that mattered, because to them, Anita was simply a sweet, respectable woman who had finally found happiness again. At least, that's what everyone believed. Music grows darker. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a strange way of coming to the surface. And Anita Deck's secrets were far from finished. In fact, they were only just beginning to catch up with her. For a long time, life in Boomersville continued just as it always had. Quiet, calm, ordinary. Anita Deck remained the same smiling, graceful woman everyone believed her to be. She attended church on Sundays, greeted her neighbors warmly, and played the role of the perfect housewife, flawlessly. To most people, there was nothing unusual about her at all. But in every small town, there are always a few people who notice things others ignore. And in Boomersville, one of those people was an elderly man named Harold Thompson. Harold had lived in the town his entire life. He knew almost everyone. He paid attention to details, and he had a habit of observing people more closely than most. At first, even Harold thought Anita was just another friendly face in the neighborhood. But over time, small things about her began to feel strange. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing dramatic, just little inconsistencies. For example, Harold noticed that Anita never seemed to have any old friends visit her. No relatives ever came to town. No childhood stories were ever shared. It was as if her life had started the moment she arrived in Boomersville. And nothing existed before that. Harold also noticed something else. Anita had a way of moving from one husband to another very smoothly, too smoothly. Whenever a man entered her life, everything seemed perfect for a short time. Then, suddenly, he would disappear from the picture completely, and Anita would simply move on. No tears, no panic, no desperation, just calm acceptance. To Harold, that didn't feel normal. One evening, while sitting outside the local grocery store, he mentioned his thoughts to a friend. "Have you ever noticed something odd about that Anita woman?" he asked quietly. The friend shrugged. "She seems nice enough to me." "Yes," Harold replied slowly, "but nice doesn't always mean innocent." It was the first time anyone in Boomersville had openly questioned Anita Deck, and once the seed of doubt was planted, it began to grow. Other small observations started coming to light. A neighbor recalled seeing Anita burning old papers late at night. Another remembered hearing a loud argument from her house months earlier, just days before her current husband had vanished. Someone else mentioned that Anita always avoided talking about where she had lived before coming to Florida. Individually, these things meant nothing, but together, they started to form a pattern that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Still, Boomersville was not a town of accusations. People preferred to mind their own business. No one wanted to believe that something truly dark could be hiding among them. So the whispers remained whispers, until something happened that changed everything. One afternoon, a traveling salesman passed through town and stopped at the local diner. While chatting with a waitress, he casually mentioned that he recognized Anita Deck. "I've seen that woman before," he said. "She used to live in a town up north, married a friend of mine." The waitress was surprised. "Oh, really? That's interesting. She never talks about her past." The salesman nodded. "Yeah, well, her husband disappeared a few years ago. Strange story." That single conversation slowly made its way through Boomersville like wildfire. Disappeared? Another husband? Suddenly, people began to look at Anita in a different light. Curiosity turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into quiet fear. Harold Thompson, now more convinced than ever, decided to do something bold. He visited the county records office and began searching for information about Anita Deck. What he found shocked him. Old marriage certificates, different towns, different years, different husbands, and next to each name, the same unsettling detail. No record of what happened to them. No divorce papers, no death certificates, no trace at all. It was as if 6 different men had simply vanished from existence after marrying Anita. Harold knew he had uncovered something serious, but what could he do with it? There was still no proof of any crime. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence. Just a disturbing pattern that no one could explain. Meanwhile, Anita continued living her life as usual, completely unaware that people were beginning to question her story. She still smiled, still attended social events, still acted like nothing in the world was wrong. But behind her back, the town was slowly changing. People who once admired her now looked at her with uncertainty. Neighbors who once trusted her now felt uneasy around her. And for the first time since she arrived in Boomersville, Anita Deck was no longer seen as the perfect woman. She was becoming something else entirely. A mystery, a question mark, a possible danger. Yet even with all the suspicion, no one dared to confront her directly, because accusing someone of something so terrible required more than rumors. It required proof, and proof was the one thing no one had. But fate has a strange way of revealing secrets at the right moment. And in Boomersville, that moment was getting closer every day. Harold Thompson continued watching Anita carefully, convinced that sooner or later the truth would come out. He often said to his wife, "People don't just disappear for no reason. One day, we're going to find out what really happened." And he was right. Because unknown to everyone at the time, Anita Deck was already preparing to repeat her familiar pattern once again. A new chapter was about to begin, and this time, the town of Boomersville would not remain in the dark. Music becomes more intense. The quiet suspicion that started as small-town gossip was slowly turning into something much more serious. And soon, events would unfold that would force everyone to see Anita Deck for who she truly was, or at least who they feared she might be. The perfect housewife was no longer perfect. The mask was beginning to crack, and behind it, something far more frightening was waiting to be revealed. By the beginning of 1953, life in Boomersville seemed normal on the surface. The sun still rose over the quiet streets, children still played outside, neighbors still greeted each other with friendly smiles. But beneath that calm exterior, something had changed. Whispers had begun, doubts had started to grow. And at the center of it all was one woman, Anita Deck. Although most people in town still treated her politely, the way they looked at her was no longer the same. The admiration that once surrounded her had slowly turned into silent suspicion. Yet Anita behaved as if nothing had changed. She continued her routine. She continued to smile. She continued to act like the perfect, innocent housewife. And then, just when people thought they had seen everything, Anita did something that surprised no one and shocked everyone at the same time. She got married again. Her 7th husband. His name was George Miller. George was a quiet, hard-working man who had recently moved to Boomersville from another state. He worked as a mechanic at a small garage on the edge of town. Unlike Anita's previous husbands, George was not wealthy or particularly outgoing. He was simple, humble, and kind-hearted. To many people, he seemed like an ordinary man looking for an ordinary life. And somehow, he had fallen in love with Anita Deck. The wedding was small and modest. Only a few neighbors attended. Anita wore a simple white dress and smiled the same warm smile she always did. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal, happy beginning. But to those who already knew about Anita's past, the marriage felt less like a celebration and more like the start of something ominous. Harold Thompson, who had been quietly observing Anita for months, shook his head when he heard the news. "Another one," he muttered to his wife. God help that poor man. Still, no one interfered. After all, suspicion alone was not enough to stop 2 adults from getting married. And so, Anita Deck became a wife once again. At first, everything appeared to be going perfectly. George and Anita were seen together around town. They shopped at the local market, attended church services, and even hosted a small dinner party for a few neighbors. From the outside, they looked like a happy couple beginning a peaceful life together. But some people noticed small, troubling signs. George, who had once been cheerful and friendly, slowly became quieter, more withdrawn, less social. Neighbors occasionally heard arguments coming from their house late at night. Nothing violent, nothing extreme, just tense voices and uncomfortable silence. One woman who lived next door later recalled, "He didn't look the same after a few months. He seemed tired all the time, almost nervous." But again, no one thought much of it. Marriages had problems. Couples argued. That was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened next. About 8 months after their wedding, George Miller suddenly stopped going to work. At first, his boss assumed he was sick. Then a few days passed. Then a week. No phone call. No message. No explanation. Concerned, the garage owner went to Anita's house to ask about him. Anita answered the door calmly. When asked where George was, she gave a simple answer. He left. The owner frowned. Left? What do you mean left? Anita sighed and repeated the same familiar story she had told so many times before. He packed his things and went away. Said he wanted a different life. It was the exact same explanation she had used for every other husband. And just like before, there was no proof to say otherwise. But this time, things felt different. George Miller had not been the type of man to just disappear. He had a job, friends, a stable routine. People who knew him found it hard to believe that he would simply walk away without telling anyone. As the days turned into weeks, questions started spreading through Boomersville. Have you seen George? Did he really leave? Something doesn't feel right. For the first time, the town was not willing to accept Anita's story so easily. A few brave neighbors went to the local police station and expressed their concerns. The sheriff listened politely, but had little to work with. There was no missing person report from George himself, no evidence of a struggle, no signs of foul play. Just a wife saying her husband had chosen to leave. Legally, there was nothing the police could do. But even the sheriff had to admit that the situation was strange, especially when he learned about Anita's history. 6 previous husbands, 6 previous disappearances, and now a 7th man gone. Even in a quiet town like Boomersville, that was hard to ignore. The sheriff decided to pay Anita a visit. He asked her gentle questions. When exactly had George left? Did he say where he was going? Had he contacted her since? Anita answered everything calmly and confidently. She showed no fear, no nervousness, no emotion at all. To the sheriff, she appeared to be just another abandoned wife, but something about her composure felt unnatural, too controlled, too perfect. Still, without evidence, the investigation went nowhere. George Miller officially became just another man who had walked away. But in the hearts of many people in Boomersville, a dark realization was slowly forming. This was no longer just a coincidence. 7 husbands, 7 disappearances. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Harold Thompson, more convinced than ever, began telling anyone who would listen, "One day, we're going to find out the truth about that woman." And he was right. Because what no one knew at the time was that Anita Deck had made a serious mistake, a mistake that would soon bring everything crashing down around her. George Miller was not like her previous husbands. He had left something behind, something Anita had not expected, and that single detail would soon turn suspicion into a full storm of investigation. Music grows darker and more intense. The 7th marriage had ended just like the others. But this time, Boomersville was watching. This time, people were paying attention. And this time, Anita Deck's carefully built world was about to begin falling apart. The disappearance of George Miller had left the town of Boomersville uneasy. What had once been whispers in the streets and small suspicions over garden fences had now grown into something heavier, a quiet fear that something was terribly wrong with the woman everyone called Anita Deck. It began with subtle changes in how neighbors looked at her. Where there was once admiration, there was now hesitation. Where there was once trust, there was now doubt. But Anita, as always, seemed unfazed. She continued her daily routines, smiling politely at people she passed, her demeanor calm and flawless. She cooked her meals. She tended to her house. She maintained her garden with the same meticulous care she had always shown. To an outsider, she was still the same perfect woman, the same ideal housewife. Yet, beneath that calm, the shadows of her past were beginning to press closer than ever before. It all started when the first piece of real evidence emerged. A local mailman, an elderly man who had delivered letters in Boomersville for decades, remembered seeing George Miller's mail piling up at the end of Anita's driveway for several days. Normally, Anita had always collected her mail punctually, but now the letters remained untouched. Curious and concerned, the mailman mentioned it to Harold Thompson. "This isn't normal," Harold said grimly. "If George really left, why wouldn't she take the letters?" Something isn't right. Harold's suspicion began to draw the attention of a few more observant townspeople. Slowly, the pieces of a troubling puzzle began to come together. Neighbors who had previously shrugged off Anita's late-night gardening noticed that she had been digging in her backyard at odd hours. Some claimed they saw her carrying heavy boxes, placing them deep in the ground where no one could see. Others whispered about strange smells that seemed to emanate from her home in the evenings, odors they could not identify, strong enough to make them cross the street. Still, all of this was circumstantial. No one could say for sure that anything illegal or sinister was happening. Then came the discovery that would change everything. One day, the county records office received a tip from a concerned resident about Anita's past. When officials began digging through old files, they discovered documents linking Anita Deck to her 6 previous husbands and the same men who had vanished mysteriously years before. Suddenly, a pattern became undeniable. 6 men, 6 disappearances. And now, George Miller, her 7th husband, had gone missing in a similar, unexplained manner. The sheriff's office, which had once dismissed rumors as gossip, was forced to take a closer look. Officers began visiting Anita's home more regularly, attempting to ask questions and observe her behavior. But every time they did, Anita remained calm, polite, and cooperative. She answered all questions with precision, her tone steady, her expressions neutral. She was never defensive, never angry, never anxious. To anyone else, she appeared completely innocent. Yet, there were things that could not be ignored. Officers noted that the garden where she had been digging late at night seemed unusually disturbed. Certain areas of the backyard were uneven, as if something had been buried. Tools were scattered in odd patterns, and the soil seemed to have been recently moved in places that appeared completely random. When questioned about it, Anita laughed lightly, waving off their concerns. "Oh, I just like to garden at night. It's peaceful. I find it relaxing," she explained. Her explanation sounded plausible, but it did little to calm the growing unease. Harold Thompson, who had been quietly documenting everything for months, decided to take matters into his own hands. He began observing Anita's house at night, keeping detailed notes of any unusual activity. It didn't take long for him to notice something chilling. During one of his late-night vigils, he saw Anita carrying a large, covered box from her garage to a far corner of her backyard. She seemed to move with practiced precision, as if she had done this many times before. He could not see what was in the box, but the careful, almost ritualistic way she handled it sent a shiver down his spine. The next morning, the ground where she had placed the box seemed oddly disturbed. Harold could not explain it, but he felt certain that something very wrong had occurred there. A few days later, Harold convinced a young neighbor to help him dig a small section of the backyard. What they found left them both stunned. It was not a body knot yet, but fragments of items that clearly belonged to someone who had lived, pieces of clothing, personal items, and other small objects. Harold's heart raced as he realized what these pieces might indicate. If his assumptions were correct, Anita Deck had done the unthinkable not once, not twice, but possibly 7 times. And now, the town's perfect, beloved housewife was no longer just a charming figure. She was a mystery that frightened everyone who had once admired her. The sheriff's office, now aware of Harold's findings, returned to Anita's house with official search warrants. As the officers began inspecting the property, Anita continued to act calmly, her demeanor composed as ever. She smiled politely at the police and answered their questions without hesitation. But inside, there was tension. Something in the air suggested that the calm facade Anita had so carefully maintained for years was starting to crack. During the search, officers discovered evidence buried deep in the backyard. They unearthed objects that belonged to her previous husband's items that confirmed Harold's suspicions. The mystery of George Miller's disappearance suddenly became a part of a pattern that stretched back years, linking all 7 men in a series of chilling events. The town of Boomersville, which had once seen Anita as the ideal neighbor and housewife, now faced the terrifying possibility that the woman they had trusted most could have been responsible for years of unsolved disappearances. People in the community were shocked. Fear spread through the town like wildfire. The admiration that had once surrounded Anita was gone, replaced by suspicion, dread, and disbelief. Even so, Anita remained unnervingly composed. She did not panic. She did not cry. She did not falter. Her perfectly practiced smile never wavered. Her demeanor never changed. The more the investigation progressed, the more people began to realize that they had lived among a woman capable of extraordinary deception. Anita Deck had played her role so convincingly for so many years that no one had ever suspected the truth, until now. The discovery of evidence in her backyard was only the beginning. Soon, more details emerged that revealed the full extent of her mysterious, unsettling history. Documents, old records, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence began to paint a picture that was both horrifying and incomprehensible. Boomersville, the small, peaceful town, was no longer the same. A shadow of fear and suspicion now lingered over every street, every home, every corner where Anita Deck had walked so gracefully for so many years. And at the center of it all, the woman herself remained calm, composed, and perfectly polite, a smile still on her face, a mystery still intact. Orkardier Karktertum, music crescendos slightly, hinting at darker revelations yet to come. Little did anyone in the town know. This was only the beginning of what would become one of the most chilling, mysterious cases in their history. For Anita Deck, the past was no longer just a series of disappearances. It was a living, breathing threat that had finally begun to catch up with her. And for Boomersville, the quiet little town where life had once seemed ordinary, there was no turning back. The perfect housewife was no longer perfect. The calm smile now carried shadows, and the secrets buried for years were finally starting to see the light. By the time the investigation into Anita Deck reached its peak, Boomersville was no longer the peaceful little town it had once been. Fear had replaced trust. Rumors had replaced smiles, and the name Anita Deck no longer carried admiration. It carried dread. For years, she had lived among them as a perfect housewife. For years, she had walked their streets, attended their gatherings, and earned their respect. And for years, no one had suspected a thing. But now, everything had changed. The discovery of suspicious evidence in her backyard had shaken the entire community. Objects belonging to her previous husbands had been found small, personal items that proved those men had not simply left, as Anita always claimed. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. But even with these discoveries, the case against Anita was far from simple. There were still no bodies, no direct witnesses, no written confessions, only circumstantial evidence and a terrifying pattern of disappearances that stretched across decades. The sheriff's department worked tirelessly, trying to uncover the full truth. Detectives from neighboring towns were brought in to assist. Old records were re-examined. Former acquaintances of Anita were questioned. Slowly, a chilling portrait of her past began to emerge. People who had known her years ago described her as charming, intelligent, and incredibly persuasive. Many admitted that she had always been able to control conversations and situations with ease. She had a way of making you believe anything, one former neighbor recalled. You could never imagine her doing something wrong. Yet, behind that charm, investigators now believed there was something much darker. More disturbing stories came to light. A woman who had lived near Anita years earlier claimed she once heard a violent argument between Anita and one of her husbands, an argument that suddenly ended in complete silence. Another person remembered seeing Anita burning large bundles of clothing late at night, shortly after one of her marriages had ended. Each story alone meant little, but together they painted a frightening picture. Despite all this, Anita Deck never changed her behavior. She never broke down, never confessed, never showed fear. Even as police searched her home, even as neighbors avoided her in the streets, she remained calm and composed. When reporters arrived in Boomersville, hoping to get a dramatic reaction from the mysterious woman at the center of the scandal, Anita simply smiled and said, "I have nothing to hide. I'm just an unlucky woman." Those words became famous across the region, but almost no one believed them anymore. As pressure mounted, the authorities tried desperately to build a case strong enough to bring Anita to trial. They searched nearby forests, lakes, and abandoned properties, hoping to find the remains of the missing men. They questioned anyone who had ever interacted with her. They dug deeper into her finances, her travel history, her old addresses. But every time they felt close to a breakthrough, the trail seemed to disappear. It was as if Anita had spent her entire life carefully erasing her tracks. Eventually, after months of investigation, the case reached a painful reality. There was strong suspicion. There were disturbing clues. There were unanswered questions, but there was not enough solid evidence to convict her of any crime. And in the eyes of the law, suspicion was not enough. Without bodies, without confessions, and without undeniable proof, The legal system had no choice. Anita Deck could not be formally charged. The town of Boomersville was left in shock. How could a woman so deeply suspected of such terrible things simply walk free? How could 7 men vanish without explanation, and yet no justice be served? It was a question no one could answer. Not long after the investigation slowed down, Anita did something that surprised no one. She quietly sold her house on Maple Street, packed her belongings, and left Boomersville forever. No goodbye, no explanation, no final words. Just like her husband's, she disappeared. Some said she moved to another state. Others believed she changed her name and started a completely new life. There were even rumors that she married again somewhere far away, but no one ever knew for sure. The woman who had lived among them for years vanished as mysteriously as the men who had entered her life. Boomersville was left to live with the aftermath. To this day, older residents still speak about Anita Deck in hushed tones. Some believe she was a cold-blooded killer who managed to escape justice. Others think she was simply a strange woman followed by unbelievable misfortune. But most agree on one thing. There was something deeply wrong about her story, something that never truly made sense. The house where she once lived still stands on Maple Street. New families have moved in over the years, unaware of the dark history connected to its walls. But longtime locals swear that strange things still happen there. Unexplained noises at night, cold spots in certain rooms, a feeling of unease that never fully goes away. Whether those stories are true or just the imagination of a haunted town, no one can say. What is certain is that Anita Deck left behind one of the greatest mysteries Boomersville had ever known. 7 husbands, 7 disappearances, and not a single answer. In the end, the case was officially closed, but for the people who lived through it, it never truly ended. Because some mysteries are never solved, some secrets are never uncovered, and some people take the truth with them when they disappear. Anita Deck was never seen in Boomersville again. Her name slowly faded from newspapers. Her story became a local legend. But even today, decades later, when someone in town mentions her name, the reaction is always the same. A pause, a nervous glance, and the quiet words, "She wasn't normal, not at all." The perfect housewife, the kind neighbor, the woman with the brightest smile, who may have been hiding the darkest soul. And somewhere out there, perhaps living a completely new life, the real truth about Anita Deck remains buried forever. In the end, the story of Anita Deck remains one of the strangest and most unsettling mysteries Boomersville has ever known. A woman who appeared perfect on the surface, a kind neighbor, a loving wife, and a respected member of the community. Yet behind that flawless image, there may have been something far darker. 7 husbands entered her life. 7 husbands disappeared, and not a single clear answer was ever found. No one was able to prove what truly happened. The law could not convict her, and history could not explain her. She simply vanished from Boomersville, just like the men who had vanished before her, leaving behind only questions, fear, and endless speculation. Was Anita Deck an innocent woman followed by terrible misfortune? Or was she one of the most calculating and mysterious criminals to ever walk unnoticed among ordinary people? The truth may never be known, but her story reminds us of one chilling reality. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden behind the most beautiful smiles, and sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we know the least.